Most people that are looking at the Canon R7 should be looking at the Fujifilm X-T4 as well. And you're going to hear a lot of people say that there has never been a camera at the price point of the R7 with these level of specs. Well, I'm here to tell you that the X-T4 is very similar, and in many ways, particularly when it comes to video, it's actually a better camera. And the first thing you're going to notice when you compare these two cameras is the build quality of the body. The Fujifilm camera is almost entirely metal with very little plastic on it at all. It actually kind of looks like a work of art. The quality of this build is super premium, and it just feels amazing in the hand. Now, the Canon isn't all plastic with a metal frame. It's not that it feels cheap, but when you put it next to the X-T4, it definitely feels inferior as far as the build quality goes. And looking at battery life, they're fairly similar. In photo mode, the R7 does 380 shots if you're shooting through the EVF, and 660 if you're shooting through the LCD. The X-T4 does 500 whether you're shooting through the EVF or the LCD. So they're fairly similar. I find in real world you actually get more than that. For whatever reason, and so many things in cameras, they overstate the stats, but pretty much always when it comes to shooting photos, they understate. So I find for the most part, either of these have a camera that will, or have a battery that will last me all day long. But if you want to be sure, I think it's worth just buying an extra battery for either camera. When it comes to video, the R7 is the clear winner with 2 hours and 15 minutes of video shooting real world tests, where the X-T4 is 1 hour and 15 minutes. So it's almost twice as good, the R7. So that is quite a significant difference between the two. And the other thing when it comes to the batteries is you can get very good quality third-party batteries now that work on par with the factory batteries, but they cost a fraction of the price. And I do use third-party batteries in both of these cameras. So I will link my recommended batteries for both of these cameras in the description down below. When it comes to the grip on these two cameras, I do prefer the grip on the Canon R7. It is really nice. It is a super deep grip. The one thing that I will say about it is if you don't have big hands, the depth and the way this grip is might actually not be so great for you. And my hands are sort of borderline big enough. If I put my thumb here, I really almost struggle to get my hand around the whole thing. The one thing I will say though about this is I like to walk around and just hold the camera at my side in one hand, and the Canon, because of that deep grip, just allows me to do that. That just hangs there, and I have a lot of confidence when I'm going around holding the Canon by the grip. I don't even feel like I need a strap attached. That is really comfortable, and I know I'm not going to drop it. If we look at the Fujifilm, it just has this tiny little nub of a grip. And that tends to be a little bit of a problem for me, and I don't feel any real level of confidence in that. And because of that, I almost always have to put a grip or a grip extension on this, which includes a plate on the bottom. That actually makes the Fuji camera a fair bit bigger. So there is a bit of a trade-off there. You can get a similar feeling by adding that grip, but you end up with a much bigger footprint. So I definitely think just based on the way they feel in the hands, the grip, the Canon R7 is much better, at least for me. Now, when we look at the overall ergonomics, this is where the cameras are very, very different, and they've got completely different philosophies when it comes to ergonomics. The Fujifilm camera obviously has the buttons and dials, the traditional sort of classic style camera setup. You've got an exposure compensation, you've got your shutter speed, and you've got your ISO. It does have sort of the dials on the front and the back, very similar to the Canon, and you can actually put it into a mode where these are your shutter and aperture and sort of treat it like a normal camera. But I think this camera appeals to people ergonomically that are going to want to use it in this sort of Fujifilm, change the buttons and dials fashion. And I really, really love to shoot like that. The Canon has a more traditional layout where you have a knob on top, and then on the back, your actual dial, it's a bit unusual. It is a joystick and dial all in one setup, which at first I didn't like. I'm kind of getting used to it now, and I actually don't mind it. The other thing that they both have somewhat in common is the Canon, you can switch to photo mode and video mode, so it's like a dedicated switch, where the Fujifilm camera, you have your on and off, and then you just have a separate little dial here that goes between photo and video mode. So they both have dedicated photo and video mode menus and setups, which means that if you put all your settings in for photography, and then you have separate settings for video. To switch back and forth, you just swap that little dial or flip that little switch, which is really nice. And a lot of cameras don't have that, and I'm glad that both of these cameras have that. One thing I will say is with the Canon, you have to do a double click to get to video mode. So your first one is your photo mode, and your second one is your video mode. Sometimes that kind of catches you by surprise. You're not sure if you're in photo mode or video mode, or you click 2 instead of 1, where the Fuji one, you've got on and off separate from the actual photo or video mode, which I kind of like a little bit better, but I don't hate the Canon one. It's just something to keep an eye on. Now, both cameras have microphone ports and headphone jacks in the side. The advantage of the Canon here is the Canon actually has a normal style headphone jack and microphone port, where the Fuji has a normal style microphone port, but then for the headphone jack, you have to use a USB-C adapter, which I don't love, and I don't know exactly why they did this, because the X-T4 did have separate ports for that. So I don't love that. I think that is definitely an advantage if you are going to be monitoring your audio. I think you're better off with the R7 just because of that little configuration. Now, both cameras have an articulating touchscreen, which is 1.62 million dots, and I think they perform very, very similar. They're actually both really, really good touchscreens. The one thing that I will point out on the Canon R7, if you're going to be filming yourself, in the Canon R7, when you flip that flip screen around, it doesn't actually point directly forward. It points a little bit off to the side, and I thought this was a little bit of a curious design. I think the reason it was done this way is so when you are behind the camera and filming, it's kind of tilted and pointing at you a little bit more at the center of the camera. So ergonomically, that is nice, the flip screen that kind of points a little bit more towards you, figuring you're going to be standing holding in the middle of the camera. But if you're in front of the camera, it actually points off to the side a bit, and it is a little bit weird and I think not quite ideal. The Fujifilm obviously just folds flat like you would expect the camera to, and it doesn't sort of tilt towards you a little bit, but you can actually bring it towards you if you want to do that. So that might just be a matter of personal preference. I think if you are behind the camera, I like the way that the R7 flips. If you are in front of the camera, I definitely like the way that the X-T4 flips. Now the R7 has a 2.36 million dot EVF, where the X-T4 has a 3.69 million dot EVF. The R7 has 1.15 times magnification, and the X-T4 has 0.75 times magnification. I prefer the EVF on the X-T4 for sure. It's just clear, it's more detail. If you're trying to nail manual focus, you're definitely going to be better off with the X-T4. I don't think the R7 is bad by any means, but if you put them both side by side, you will definitely notice that the X-T4 has a better EVF. And one big difference between these two cameras is the menu system. And Canon's menu system is pretty much the gold standard for an easy to use and easy to find menu system. I think for beginners, the Canon menu system is far above any other menu system on the market right now. The other thing with the Canon menu system is you can navigate the entire menu system via touchscreen, just like you would on your phone. And it is extremely intuitive, and it really is like using a phone. The touchscreen is just so responsive. The Fujifilm camera has one of the worst menu systems you can get. It's probably about as bad as the Sony menu system. Maybe not quite that bad, but pretty close. And for beginners, it can be very, very difficult. And I have been shooting with the Fuji camera for years, and there are still times where I'm digging around, trying to find what I need. And really, it's probably the single most disappointing thing about this camera. Another super annoying thing about the menu system in the Fuji is when you go in and change a setting, and you're like, okay, I think that's the setting I want. And then you back out of the menu system, and maybe you take a sample photo or shoot a bit of video, and then you want to go back and say, oh, that wasn't quite what I wanted, I'm going to tweak it again. When you go back into the menu system, on the Canon, it just goes back to where you left off. It assumes, yeah, that's where you want to work. Maybe you want to change or tweak that setting a little bit more. The Fujifilm menu system just goes back to the beginning of the whole thing. And sometimes with these menus, what you're looking for is 2 or 3 levels deep. So you've got to go through the menu, down a level, through the menu, down a level again. It is a real pain. And as I said, I think that is probably the single worst quality about the Fujifilm camera. The other thing is it is not touch navigatable. So you have to navigate by sort of just pressing dials and buttons to move around the menu system. I don't understand why this is. Worst thing about the Fuji cameras, all of them, I think, is the menu system. Now, looking at the kit lenses between these two cameras, you have two completely different approaches to kit lenses. The Canon kit lens is an all plastic lens, at least on the outside. It has a plastic mount. It is both a cheap looking and feeling lens. This is very much in Canon's tradition of giving you a kit lens that they want you to feel like isn't great, so you're going to need to upgrade to a better lens. And certainly when you look at this lens, it gives off that vibe. It is truly plastic fantastic. You can even see sort of the seams in the plastic mold on the lens. The build quality is not great. The Fujifilm camera comes with a kit lens that is a combination of plastic and metal. It really does not feel like a kit lens at all. Beyond that, the Fujifilm kit lens, actually the 18 to 55, and there are a couple different options. There's an 18 to 55 and the 16 to 80. Those are the two lenses you can get as a kit lens with the X-T4. Both of them are equally high quality build, and both of them have incredible image quality. The 18 to 55 actually at 18 millimeters goes down to f2.8. That's going to let a lot of light in or more light in, and that is going to get you better low light photo and video. And at the long end, when you zoom to 55, you're still only at f4. The Canon lens at 18 millimeters starts at 3.5, and then when you zoom in, you end up at, I think it's 6.3. So you are not getting nearly as much light in. It's not going to be as good in low light conditions. So that's something to take in mind, take into account if you are shooting in low light conditions. The other thing I will say, though, is the Fujifilm is the 18 to 55 is the standard kit lens. As I said, there's a 16 to 80 sort of upgraded kit lens. The Canon kit lens is 18 to 150, which is an incredible range. So the Canon lens definitely has an advantage as far as versatility and reach. So I would also say that the image quality is good on the Canon lens, but not great. The Fujifilm, both of the lenses are great, and the 16 to 80 is incredibly sharp, possibly one of the sharpest zoom lenses I've ever used. So both of those are fantastic lenses. But I can still see situations where I would pick the Canon lens purely for that 18 to 150 versatility. Also, the fact that it's an all plastic lens makes it quite lightweight. And when I weighed both of these cameras, even though this is only an 18 to, even though this is only an 18 to 55 versus an 18 to 150, because you've got this plastic lens and because you've got a plastic body, the Fujifilm camera is all slightly heavier. I think it's only like 10 grams or something, so there's not a lot in it, but it is slightly heavier. So you are getting more versatility with the zoom range with this bigger 18 to 150, and you're getting a little bit lighter camera. Not enough that it would make the difference between buying one or the other based on weight, but it does show that there are some advantages to that plastic fantastic lens. And you'll notice that I've got lens hoods on both of these lenses right now. The Fuji camera, the 18 to 55 kit lens does come with the lens hood. The Canon does not, but I think I only paid about $10 for this. So if you do buy the Canon, I do suggest that you buy this little lens hood separately. A couple things it does. One, it does improve image quality and detail and contrast when there is sun coming from the side. The other thing it does is when you're walking around, if you do bump the lens into something, it gives you an extra level of protection. That lens hood just acts like a sort of an impact layer or a bumper to actually protect the front element of the lens. And I will link that R7 lens hood down in the description below. When it comes to IBIS performance, I think they're pretty similar. Particularly in photography, I would say that both are just as good as each other. When it comes to video, the Canon is definitely better. It's definitely smoother. The Fuji camera is good in video, but also, the way the IBIS works depends on the lens, so it works sort of better in some lenses than other lenses. Also, the Fuji camera has a tendency when you're panning or moving, particularly with that 16 to 80 zoom lens, has a tendency to jump around. So it's like, it feels like it's being left behind and it's got to jump to catch up, which makes the video in some cases look really terrible, where I don't find that with the Canon. It's much smoother, particularly with doing pans and stuff. So purely when it comes to IBIS for video, I prefer the Canon. When it comes to photo, I think you almost can't differentiate between the two. I think they're very, very similar. And one interesting thing to note about the IBIS systems, in the Fuji, when you turn it on, you hear this little sort of tiny little click and it comes on. With the Canon, you turn it on and the camera almost like jumps out of your hands when you hear that IBIS engage. It's very strange. Anyways, just a little side note. So if you do get the Canon and you turn it on and it feels like it's jumping in your hand and makes a weird noise, that's just the way the Canons are. Looking at autofocus, a lot has been made about the Canon R7 autofocus, which is excellent, particularly with its sort of eye detect and its animal tracking and vehicle tracking. It's an incredible autofocus system. The one thing I will say is, as of the current firmware, when this was released, it does have a tendency to miss more than you would think, and it back and front focuses all the time. It's something that the reviewers aren't talking about, but I would say as often when an object is far away, as often as 30% of the time, the camera tells you that it's got the shot in focus, and it absolutely does not. So that is something to watch out for. The specs are great. The idea behind it's great, but it probably isn't quite as good as you might think it is based on the reviews you're seeing. Having said that, it is still superior to the Fuji autofocus system. When it comes to photography, the Fuji is close-ish to the Canon, but I would say not quite as good. But when it comes to video, the Canon is far, far better. Although at the time of making this video, it does sometimes drift off when it's shooting your face. It'll just drift off to the background. Something that Canon cameras generally don't do, but what we have seen with the Canon cameras in the past is often the first release is imperfect, and I expect we will get a firmware update for this camera, which will bring it into line with the other Canon cameras, which is almost completely infallible. The Fuji camera's been on the market for a while, and they have continued to revise the algorithm for the autofocus. It's probably as good as it's going to get right now, and it's still not great. Particularly in video, you are often going to get pulsing and hunting, and it's going to be looking at the background. I think it is usable in most situations, but when it comes to video, I will say that the Fuji camera, as much as 5 to 10% of the time, the Fuji camera will do some crazy hunting, pulsing autofocus thing that will just ruin your shot. The other thing in comparing these, the Canon autofocus system has a number of ways that you can tweak the speed and the way the autofocus works, but out of camera, you just turn it on and it works pretty well. To get the best out of the Fuji, you have to play with those autofocus settings and the different speeds that it offers. And in addition to that, disappointingly, what works well with one lens, one set of autofocus settings that works one lens, doesn't always work well with another lens. So you actually have to set your autofocus settings differently depending on the lens you're using, which is super annoying. And I don't expect that to be the case with the Canon. Looking at the video specs, just on the surface, the key thing you're going to hear about the R7 is it shoots 10-bit 422 video footage. Now, 10-bit 422 is just a reflection of how much color information is in the shot. If you look at the X-T4, that shoots 10-bit 420. So just based on that spec, the Fujifilm camera is a little bit behind. I won't go into the technicalities of how that works, but essentially the Fujifilm camera is getting a little bit less color information than the Canon R7. In real-world testing, I am not seeing any difference between the two as far as that information goes. It isn't actually changing anything with what I'm seeing with the footage. But importantly, you can only access that 10-bit 422 in the Canon if you shoot log footage. And log footage is similar to sort of like a raw photo. It's this really sort of washed out footage that you absolutely have to edit and color grade to make look good. If you want to shoot in one of the Canon profiles that gives you good Canon colors straight out of the camera, which is, for me, a big reason to get a Canon because of the great out-of-camera colors, and you don't need to edit to get great colors. If you shoot in one of those profiles, you only get 8-bit. And when you shoot 8-bit, if you underexpose that image and you want to tweak it in editing, I found that this sort of the standard 8-bit footage out of the Canon R7 falls apart very, very quickly and does not look great. The other thing about the Canon is it only shoots what's called IPB codec, which essentially means that Rather than saving every frame of video as a separate frame, it takes one frame of video, gets what it looks like, and then the next approximately 5 frames, it just updates what's changed in that frame, and then it gives you a brand new full frame at the sort of next 5th or 6th frame. So it is a higher level of compression and a lower level of quality. The Canon R7 can shoot all I, which means that you get every single frame, the full frame. This is easier to be edited. It's easier for your computer to edit because it takes less processing power to unpack what that sort of packing down has done. It also gets you better quality video. Importantly, the X-T4 can also shoot its 10-bit 420 in all of its picture profiles. So that means if you want to get good camera, out of camera colors, and you want to shoot your video, but you still want to have the ability to edit that or tweak the exposure if you need, you can do that in the Fuji camera. You cannot do that in the Canon camera. You have to shoot log footage in the Canon camera to get the best footage. You can shoot in any of the picture profiles in the Fuji camera and get sort of excellent right out of camera footage and still have all that flexibility. And for me, for that reason, the Fujifilm camera is a far superior video camera because I like to shoot as close as I can, get out of camera as close as I can what I want my finished image to look like, so that it only takes a little bit of tweaking and editing, particularly if you're doing sort of videos or turning things over the internet and you're not just like shooting some sort of commercial thing. In addition to that, you can get that all I in the Fuji, which you cannot get in the Canon. So even if you were shooting commercial projects, I think having an all I or every single frame saved separately is much better than the compressed frames that you get out of the Canon. So even taking those things into account and shooting log, I would still take the Fuji camera. As far as the sharpness and the detail goes, when I shot these two at their maximum settings, I couldn't tell the difference. I thought they were virtually identical. And even though the Canon camera is 7K downsampled to 4K and the Fujifilm is 6K downsampled to 4K, really, as far as the detail goes, I think they were completely inseparable. Another big difference between these two cameras in their top level 4K settings. The Canon camera has quite significant rolling shutter, which means if you pan the camera, everything looks like it's wibbling and wobbling and slanting quite significantly. Now, this isn't as bad as the Sony APS-C cameras, which are absolutely terrible, but the Fujifilm camera does not have nearly those issues. So if you're shooting action, if you're shooting video of action and you're going to be moving and tilting and panning and moving the camera around a lot, that's really going to be noticeable in the Canon, and it can be very hard, if not impossible, to correct in editing, where you're going to get a much more natural look with much less rolling shutter out of the Fuji camera. Now, both of these cameras shoot 4K 60 frames per second. In the Canon R7, it goes away from that oversampled fine mode, so there must be some sort of line skipping or something. That just means that the video footage doesn't have the same level of detail as the 4K fine footage does. Now, the Fujifilm camera has its own disadvantage, which it has a 1.18 times crop factor to shoot in 4K 60. This is a very small crop, but you actually get much better, much more detailed footage than you can with the Canon. Also keep in mind in that 4K 60 in the Fuji, you actually get to shoot in all I, which means that every single frame is saved separately. In the Canon, that's going to be that compressed format where it saves one full frame every 5 frames, and then it sort of makes up the difference in between. So you're going to get much better, much more detailed footage out of the Fuji at 4K 60. When it comes to slow motion, the Canon camera can shoot up to 120 frames per second in 1080, and the X-T4 can shoot 120 frames per second or 240 frames per second in 1080. Now, I will say the 240 isn't the sharpest sort of image going around, but it does give you that ultra slow motion, something different to play with, something that's not available in the Canon R7. When it comes to high ISO noise performance, it can be actually quite hard to compare this between cameras nowadays. And even though you won't see anybody really talk about this in their videos or reviews of any cameras now, most of the improvement in the high ISO noise performance of cameras that have come out in recent years don't come from a sensor that is better and has better sensitivity in low light or at high ISO. It actually comes from ISO noise cleaning or noise filtering that is applied digitally inside the cameras. And both of these cameras have high ISO noise reduction built into them. The Canon camera comes with 4 different settings, which is off, low, medium, and high. And the Fuji camera comes with, I think it's 9 different settings, from 0 to +4 or down to -4. Now, in the Fuji, I believe -4 is actually off, and 0 is medium, and +4 is the highest level. In the Canon camera, I think it's obviously off, low, medium, and high. So I have just shot these samples using the Fuji in its default mode of 0 and the Canon R7 in its default mode of medium. And I think they are very, very similar. If you did take the time to go through all these different settings and play with them, you might get a slightly different result. But for the most part, I think at high ISO, you're not going to be seeing such a significant difference that I would pick one camera over the other based on that single factor alone. Now, when we look at the out-of-camera color on both of these cameras, they are both the market leaders, and I really struggle to say which one I like more. I think the Fuji camera gives you a little bit more pizzazz, a little bit more shine on the colors. There's something a little bit more stylized about the Fuji camera. I think the Canon camera is better at giving you slightly more natural colors, particularly skin tones, although I do love the Astia profile for skin tones on the Canon X-T4. So I think when we're talking about out-of-camera colors on the two, it's really going to be more a matter of personal preference than one being better than the other. The one thing I will say is, with the Fujifilm camera, you have a lot more control of your colors. And in fact, the Fujifilm camera gives you the ability to adjust how your highlights and your shadows are exposed. So you can have the camera lift those shadows or reduce the highlights and drop the shadows. And essentially it gives you a look, both in photo and in video, as if you've played with an S curve or a curve setting in editing, but you can put it into the camera, which allows you to get a look out of camera that looks more like you would want if you were going to edit it in the end. With the Canon camera, you don't have those features and you don't have that flexibility. So I think, once again, coming back to the best image out of camera, you're going to have a lot more control in the Fuji. The Fuji camera also has the ability for photography to add some grain effects and some different sort of really higher level editing. It's almost like having filters in the camera. So you combine all these different things, chroma effects. You can go out and think about what you want your finished photo to look like. You can go in and configure all these settings. And when you take a photo, there'll be a split second and the camera actually takes the photo before it writes to the card. It actually edits the image and makes it look like the finished image that you are shooting for. Now you can shoot in RAW and JPEG, and that way you actually get an edited JPEG saved to the card and the RAW file, so if you want to go back and change things. The other thing that's incredible about the Fuji camera is you can take that RAW file, if you've got it while it's in camera, and edit it in camera by applying all these different settings. So you can decide how you want your shadows, your highlights to look, what grain effects you want. You can configure all these things and say, okay, let's apply these to a specific RAW file. It will turn it into a JPEG file, and now you have essentially edited in the camera. And if you want to just upload this to Instagram, you just connect via Bluetooth, transfer the thing over. Don't even have to edit the thing on your phone. You've got the finished photo that's been edited in the camera, and you upload it straight to Instagram or whatever sort of sharing platform you're using. So once again, out of camera results, the Fuji is unbelievable in a way that the Canon really can't touch it. Just looking at the RAW files between the two, I do have a tendency to prefer editing the Canon RAW files. I think they do look a little bit more natural. Having said that, the Fujifilm RAW files actually have a little bit more flexibility as far as lifting those shadows up and sort of how many stops you can actually underexpose and save the image. You're definitely getting more out of the Fuji camera. They both do a great job, but the Fuji camera is definitely better at saving an underexposed image. But once again, when it comes to natural colors and skin tones in the RAW files, I prefer the Canon camera. Now, when it comes to the dynamic range of both of these sensors, which is the difference between the brightest part of the image and the darkest part of the image that can be properly exposed, I have done a few different RAW tests and put them side by side, and I've really struggled to differentiate between the two. I think they are quite similar. I have tried to find online somebody who's actually done the statistical analysis of both of these sensors side by side, and I haven't been able to find something. So hopefully we'll see something like that in the future. But just in my little bit of testing, I think they're close enough that I probably wouldn't pick one over the other based on dynamic range alone. Another critical thing to think about when comparing these two cameras is the lens selection. The Fujifilm camera being a crop sensor, this is their main line that they sell. Fujifilm has a crop sensor line, APS-C line, and then they go up to a medium format sensor. Because of that, Fujifilm has put a lot of resources into their lens development for their APS-C lenses that work with the X-T4. I believe personally that the Fujifilm lens lineup is the best APS-C lens lineup out there, and I think most other experts think the same. The Canon camera, Canon seems to view their APS-C cameras as like a stepping stone to full-frame cameras. And because of that, they really always restricted the amount of APS-C size lenses that you can get for their mounts. And they've also restricted the quality of those lenses. So I think in the future, we're definitely going to see more lenses for the Canon R7 in APS-C mount lenses dedicated to APS-C sensors. But they're not probably going to be anywhere near the quality that you can get in the Fuji lineup or the different range of options that you have in the Fuji lineup. The Fuji lenses are also incredibly well built. All the new Canon lenses in general seem to be mostly plastic for whatever reason. This seems to be the way that Canon is going with plastic lenses. So if you're looking at which lineup is going to give you the best lenses, it's not even close in this regard. The Fujifilm X-T4 is miles ahead. And you can also get adapters for both of these cameras to use Canon old DSLR glass, whether that be EFS made for crop sensor or EF glass made for full frame sensor, and use those lenses or that glass on either of these cameras. And the Canon one obviously works a little bit better because the autofocus system is just the same. It just passes the information along through the adapter and sort of resizes the mount so it works with those lenses, where the Fuji one has to do a little bit of processing. But it is a way to access a whole bunch of lenses that you can't otherwise. And I will link my recommended adapters for both of these cameras in the description down below. And if you've been wondering after looking at these two cameras, should I just go with a full frame camera? I've just thrown a video on screen now. This is a comparison between the Canon R7 and the Canon RP. This is Canon's cheapest full frame sensor camera, and it's actually cheaper than the Canon R7, and it does allow you to take advantage of sort of full frame RF lenses, which is what Canon is really focusing on for their lens lineup right now.